Welcome everyone, Costini here with my DLC tier list for Total War Warhammer free, because at the moment, as I'm recording this, there's a major Steam sale for DLC for Warhammer free until November 28th. And the discount is 50% for the vast majority of DLCs, though for things like Shadows of Change, Forge of Chaos Dwarfs, it is 20%. It's interesting to note that they put a 20% discount on Shadows of Change, even though it didn't come out all that long ago. Well, it just reflects how poorly that DLC may have done. That's my perspective on that, my read on the situation. Now, here's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on which DLCs are worth it and which DLCs are not. Like, basically, which DLCs... Like, I hate to talk about the value proposition, because, like, the idea, oh, if the price is such and the content is such, it's worth it. No. I'm going to focus on, like, which DLCs offer meaningful content that's actually worth playing, and which DLCs do not offer meaningful content. So, let's start with that, with the Warriors of Chaos, the first DLC for Warhammer 1. It's a bit of a mixed bag, really, when we're thinking about Warriors of Chaos. On one hand, it is a fairly cheap DLC you can pick up. On the other hand, we do have the Champions of Chaos DLC. But you can also make the point with Warriors of Chaos that with this DLC, you do get access to the best Legendary Lords of the Warriors of Chaos and most of the content, except like the variant units. So Archaon, Sigvald, Kolic are significantly better Legendary Lords in a lot of ways than say someone like Village. Festus is okay, though not especially great. Like, I would rather play Archaon in a campaign. Like, if I'm playing a long campaign as Warriors of Chaos, I would rather play Archaon. Or Kolic. Kolic can be a lot of fun. Hell, even Sigvald. The real benefit for the Undivided Warriors of Chaos, as opposed to the god-specific ones, the monogod ones, is that you get access, like, if you then buy the Champions of Chaos DLC, like, you get access to all the units with them. So, playing Sigvald, playing Archaon, though you can always play Be'lakor. So, it's kind of a tricky one to say. I mean, I think there's a lot of value in it, quote-unquote value, because it's certainly cheaper than Champions of Chaos. But from the content proposition, like, if Be'lakor wasn't playable, I would say it's an A tier. But since Be'lakor is playable and he's available for free, I would say this DLC gets a B tier rating. It's just because of the decision to make Be'lakor playable for free with Immortal Empires that does take it down a bit. Though, to be clear, it would be down even further on this list if it wasn't so cheap at the moment. Then we have the King and the Warlord DLC. Like, while this DLC may not seem all that great when we're talking about the lack of racial changes, the content it offers for the Dwarves and the Greenskins is substantial. Like, if you're going to play a Greenskin campaign, and especially if you're going to play a Dwarf campaign, this DLC is absolutely a must-have. Skarsenik's and Belegar's campaigns are pretty awful. Skarsenik because of the campaign mechanics, Belegar because of his starting position. Like, in Immortal Empires, it is better to play... better to play Forgrim and eventually Confederate Belegar. He's much more worth it there. Though keep in mind, I believe you can't Confederate if you don't own DLC. It's kind of hard for me to figure that out, so let me know if I'm full of it. But what I do know, like, based on what I know, is like you can't Confederate if you don't own the DLC. So if you want Belegar, and if you want Skarsenik as well, if you're playing Greenskins, you want this DLC. But the important things, it's like for the Dwarves, it adds things like Rangers, it adds the Rune Lord. The Bolt Throwers are worthless, but it does add things that are important. For the Greenskins, this adds arguably the most powerful unit in their roster. So this is an A-tier DLC in terms of the content it offers. Not the most interesting campaign mechanics, and certainly not the most interesting campaigns, but in terms of the value you get from the lore choice for the Dwarves, also Rangers diversifying your army, and on top of that, the significant value proposition you get from Nasty Skulkers for the Greenskins, like the Nasty Skulkers alone make this DLC worth buying. And it's certainly one of the cheaper ones available there as well. Then we get the Grim and the Grave DLC. This is a tricky one. I think Grim and the Grave is... It's hard to really say. Like, the vampire counts don't really need the units in this DLC. Helm and Gorst is not really fun to play at all. And while Volkmar is technically the best Imperial campaign, even with this DLC, I'd say the Empire is still crap. On the other hand, trying to play an Imperial campaign without both Imperial DLCs is a rather painful experience. So I'm going to put this in D tier, though I would consider it mandatory if you're looking to play any Imperial campaign. Just keep that particular aspect in mind with this DLC. Just keep in mind that particular caveat. Essential for the Empire, not important for the Vampire Count. So it is the only DLC for the Vampire Count. So if you're looking to spice up your roster, I'd recommend it, but it's really not a great DLC. It's just the Vampire Counts don't have any other, really, and the Empire is a really bad race that needs all the help it can get. Like, the Empire is F tier minus without both the DLCs that affect it. Then we have Call of the Beastmen. It's an interesting one to think about, the Call of the Beastmen. So you have 3 Legendary Lords. Well, technically the DLC only has 2, but you want Mogr, you're going to want to get this DLC. So you get 3 Legendary Lords, but you don't need this DLC to be able to play the Beastmen. So it's not important. And while it may diversify your campaigns, this DLC is not important at all. The campaigns can be fun, but really this DLC, I'm tempted to put it in C because the Beastmen are much better to play than the Empire. And I would say just having 3 extra Legendary Lords for Tarax is a bit more important than having Helm and Gorst for the Vampire Counts. Though, ultimately, I think it's also a D tier DLC. Don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily bad, but if you're making these decisions based okay, what's worth paying for because I want to improve my experience in the game, this is not the DLC you need to have for the Beastmen. Far from it. You don't need it to play the race. You only get the Legendary Lords. That's the only benefit, I think, for this particular DLC. The only real meaningful benefit with this. Then we get Realm of the Wood Elves. This is just going to be similar boat as Call of the Beastmen, though a bit better. The reason it's a bit better is if you want to, with the Wood Elves, I would say while the Sisters of Twilight certainly have a great campaign, if you don't own this DLC, while you can certainly play, you can certainly get access to the other Legendary Lords of the Wood Elves through confederations. You can confederate Orion, you can confederate Durfu with the Sisters of Twilight. Even if you don't own this DLC, you do get Draika as an option. And I think the difference between Draika and say the Beastmen Lords, the Beastmen Legendary Lords, the base ones, kind of play the same. Sure, there's a variety in their campaigns and all that, but they kind of end up playing the same. Draika has a very significant playstyle and certain unique units that you will only get for this DLC, or variants of units that you will only get by getting this DLC. Specifically, the Malevolent Tree Spirits. And I think Draika's campaign is actually a lot more fun. It's only slightly edging it out versus, Call of the Beastmen. The problem isn't, by the way, that the Beastmen or Wood Elves aren't races worth playing. It's the fact that you can get access to these races through other means. I'd say Call of Beastmen is... Call of the... Realm of the Wood Elves, Realm of the Wood Elves is better as a DLC just because what Draika has to offer, which can be really hard to access otherwise. And you won't be able to recruit her unique units in any of the other Wood Elf campaigns. So if you want to enjoy Malevolent Treekin, and Jesus, they're powerful, you want this DLC. Blood for the Blood God, I'm not even going to pretend that this is anything other than an F-tier cash grab DLC. Though, as Mandalorian Gaming noted in his review of Warhammer 3, melee animations may be affected by not having this DLC. But absolutely not worth it as the DLC on any perspective. It is the cheapest DLC by far. It's also the worst DLC by far. Then we have Norska. Norska is F tier. I'm not even going to try and pretend otherwise. Now, people might disagree that, Norska isn't that bad. Let me explain what the issue with Norska is. The problem with Norska is you only get 2 campaigns, and both of them are kind of similar. So you really end up with just one campaign with some small differences between them. But the problem with Norska as a race is they're pretty broken. Monster hunts don't work. Their economy doesn't work. The balancing that they have on the campaign situation doesn't work. They have a bad campaign dynamic. Overall, Their army roster is perfectly fine. You can certainly win battles with Norska. You can do quite well in individual battles, but it's really the frustrating campaign mechanics that drag Norska down. Though maybe I'm a bit too harsh putting it in F. Maybe they deserve a D. D over here, because there is certainly another race pack that is far worse. Actually, yeah, I'm going to put it in D, because while I would say, look, it's kind of hard for me to say. On one hand, Norska is not as bad as some other DLCs that I'm going to put here, and I know which ones I'm already going to do. On the other hand, it is absolutely not worth buying. And that's the thing, ultimately, about Norska. While it's not as bad as some others, it is still pretty bloody awful as a DLC to consider. And by the way, I'm going to order them, so from left to right, the best on the left, right is the worst. Then we have the Queen and the Crone DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. This adds Alariel, so if you're playing a Tyrion campaign, you kind of want this DLC. Actually, if you're playing a High Elf campaign, you want this DLC in general. It adds Handmaidens, it adds Hargonef for the Dark Elves. There's some really useful things in this DLC. So from my perspective, this is a B-tier DLC for the game, because while it's not as exciting as some other DLCs, the things it adds are important. Maybe even A-tier, though. To be fair, let me be blunt on this. The reason King the Warlord is A-tier and this is B-tier, King the Warlord is far more significant for the Greenskins, and it's a necessity really for the Dwarves in a lot of ways. Whereas Queen and the Crone, while it adds very useful stuff, is not essential to enjoy a High Elven or, more crucially, Dark Elven campaign. You can do so without this DLC. It will make things more complicated in terms of confederations on Ulthuan, but that's really the main thing you'll lose. Losing Handmaidens is obviously a significant downside in a long campaign, but as stated, you can certainly enjoy a High Elven campaign even without them. And then we get the Curse of the Vampire Coast. Yeah, F tier. Like, by far F tier. The problem with the Vampire Coast, they don't work. Their army roster is awful. Their economy is awful. Their campaign mechanics aren't well thought out. Like, they could be considered a unique campaign, but really, playing them is just not a great experience. You're basically playing a campaign where you don't really have an army. Like, you can play Sartosa and have an army, though you need the Ogre Kingdoms DLC to really make that work. But you do have powerful artillery, to be sure, and you do have some powerful monstrous units as well. But for most of the campaign, you're not really going to have an army because the zombies just have really poor leadership, very weak stats, poor range, and they're gunpowder-centric. And the problem with gunpowder-centric in Warhammer 2, in Warhammer 3, as opposed to 2, gunpowder really works very poorly in Warhammer 3. It worked better in Warhammer 2. That's one of the crucial differences to know. So these guys are awful to play in a lot of ways. Their economy is also limited on the campaign map. Like, basically, one of the things to understand about Warhammer 3 as opposed to 2, Warhammer 3 is about building factions with as many armies as possible. You can't really do that if you're playing the Vampire Coast. You can build 1-2 armies reasonably quickly, though you'll be running out of money. You can rely on sacking and looting settlements, but this is similar to Norska. Like, the campaign dynamics just don't work well within the context of Warhammer 3. And the difference, of course, is that Norska was not especially great even when they came out. But we're talking here about Warhammer 3 specifically. Like Norska at least has an army that works in Warhammer 3. The Vampire Coast doesn't have even that, so it's actually a far worse DLC. That's the reason I consider putting Norska in D tier, because like at least you can win battles without relying on mass lords, mass heroes, lord, and artillery. Whereas if you're playing the Vampire Coast, you're going to have a pretty awful gameplay, campaign, and battles. Then we move on to Prophet and the Warlock. Absolutely an A tier, if not actually S tier DLC. I've got a bit of mixed feelings on this. Like, if Rattling Gunners and Giselles worked better, I would say this is an S tier DLC. For the Lizardmen, this DLC is not really important all that much in any significant way. For the Skaven, kind of is, kind of isn't. The reason it kind of isn't is because As I stated, Rattling Gunners and Giselles just don't work very well as gunpowder units. You can certainly make them work, but like Ica Claw is not one of the best designed campaigns at the moment. Starting position, all that kind of stuff. So while it does offer a ton of value for what it is, I just don't think it reaches S tier status from my perspective. We move on. So Hunter and the Beast, it's in the same boat as Grim the Grave. Like, basically, Nakai is not a great campaign for the Lizardmen. The reason he's not great, it's like, again, we have a campaign which is divorced from the realities of the Warhammer free meta, if you will. It doesn't necessarily work all that well, and while certainly Marcus Wolfhard can work decently well, the Empire is a pile of trash. Though, if you're going to play an Empire campaign, I'd say this is far more important to have as DLC than Grim the Grave, because Archers and Huntsmen are far more important than what Grim the Grave does at. Though, keep in mind, Arch Selectors for the Empire from Grim the Grave are also very, very important to have. They're the best lords to command an army. Moving on. So, with the Tomb Kings, looking at the Tomb King situation over here, well, the Tomb Kings work decently well, but again, you have a race that was designed for a certain meta where limited armies were a thing, and they're certainly not the case in Warhammer, in Warhammer 3. So the fact you have to wait 15 turns to get the second army in most Tomb Kings campaigns, the fact Katep's campaign is awful, Cetra's is not necessarily significantly better, though at least he starts in Camry, so that's better. The Books of Nagash situation is awful, and the pacing of the campaign is just slow. Archon is a lot of fun, however, can be a lot of fun because you do start with multiple armies from the very beginning, and you do have more unit types, so Archon actually works within the meta of Warhammer 3, far better than others. But yeah, can't really recommend this more than a C tier, really. It's okay, it's middle of the road, basically. It's not horrible, it's not great either. Moving on, Shadow and Blade, this is an S tier DLC. For the Dark Elves, this adds the Master Hero. And Masters are pretty useful. You can get a lot of them very quickly. Like, there's a lot of power that you do get for this DLC just from having a hero that you can spam far more easily than others. And that's one of the benefits with the Blade aspect. Then you have what I consider the best Skaven campaign with Snitch. Like, Ica Claw can be a really fun campaign if you get past the starting position. Snitch starts with a good starting position and doesn't have the same frustration that you have every time you start an Ica Claw campaign. Though, Ica Claw is a lot of fun in Old World. Also, I do have to mention that the Skaven units this adds, specifically the artillery, it's kind of hilarious when you think about it, but the actual quote-unquote artillery units, or some of the units added here, are significantly better than what Prophet and Warlock adds for the Skaven. If there is a Skaven DLC I think people should own, it is that one. If there's a Dark Elf DLC I think people should own, it is that one. While Malice Darkblade's campaign isn't necessarily the best, he certainly is a powerful legendary lord as well. Just not necessarily a great campaign dynamic, but he can work like incredibly powerful. I'm just a bigger fan of Marafi, personally. War Than a Punch, yeah, this is not even a contest, fucking S tier by far. Like, what this DLC adds for the Greenskins is like incredible. This was the DLC that remade the Greenskins. Well, that's no longer, that's not an important consideration when you're deciding which DLC to buy. Let me explain why this DLC is so important for the Greenskins. One, you get, beyond the fact that you get one of the best campaigns with Grom, you get a good campaign that can be pretty interesting with Elfarian. Beyond that aspect, and Elfarian gets a bunch of unique units as well. But what's really important, and you get Archmages for the High Elves, so pretty damn important for the High Elves to have that lore choice. But it's less about the High Elves, more about the Greenskins. Kind of funny track record over there that the DLCs involving Greenskins are far more important for the Greenskins, though they're also important for the other races. But if we're looking at the Greenskins, there's two things this DLC does add for the Greenskins that are vital in any campaign. Like, Greenskins without this DLC will be significantly weaker. Two things. One, it adds casualty replenishment through the Giant River Troll Hags, which are a very powerful hero. You can get a lot of them. The second thing is that it adds stone trolls, which give you a siege breaker ability. Like you get these chunky, powerful melee units. They can get that tier 3. You can get a lot of them. They're incredibly powerful. They do a lot in battles. They're not really that expensive. They may take 2 turns to recruit, but they are pretty good. Like having 4 stone trolls in every army is pretty powerful. And again, Grom's campaign is really good. Elfarian's campaign is pretty good. Highly recommend this particular DLC. Like if you're going to buy anything for Greenskins, get this DLC. Like while Nasty Skulkers are important, undeniably so, I would say like for the proper Greenskin experience, you should own both of these. If I had to choose, I would certainly go for the one that gives me extra casualty replenishment and Stone Trolls versus Nasty Skulkers. Because you can use Stone Trolls throughout the entire campaign. There's a point where Nasty Skulkers are not necessarily worth using anymore, except for trash armies. Then we go into the Twisted and the Twilight as a DLC, absolutely. Also an S tier DLC. Not necessarily for the Skaven part of it, which is a bit surprising. You might think all the Skaven DLCs really benefit the Skaven. They do. But this DLC is about the Wood Elves. You get access to the Wood Elves. You get a really powerful and interesting Legendary Lord. You open up a new playstyle for the Wood Elves that doesn't exist in every campaign, in other campaigns. Because while Drykel can be unique in her units, she's not unique in her playstyle. Like using melee units as the Wood Elves, yeah, Durfa does that as well. The sisters, Twilight, they use flying units. So that's a new playstyle. It's also the better deal between these DLCs. Like this is the significantly better deal out of these DLCs because you can actually get Orion and Durfu while owning this DLC because you can confederate them. It's an interesting decision that Creative Assembly made over here that they didn't make for other DLCs. Unless they changed it, I don't know if they did, but for a long time I never bought the Wood Elves because, well, I didn't bother with them for Warhammer 1, and I didn't bother with them in Warhammer 2, and by the time that, before their rework, because I didn't think that they were worth buying, based on the things I was seeing there, and when they were reworked, they added this DLC, which made buying the Wood Elves redundant, because you could still, again, get Durfa and Orion through confederations. So a great DLC, especially for the Wood Elves. The accessibility of the Wood Elves makes it a great DLC. Then we have Silence and the Fury, another S-tier DLC. Gives you access to Beastmen, gives you the best Legendary Lord for the Lizardmen, opens up a new playstyle for the Lizardmen in a way that just doesn't exist in any other campaign. You can talk about Prophet and Warlock and Tenowin, but it's just not quite the same. So Tarax is the best Legendary Lord for the Beastmen. Oxyatl is the best Legendary Lord for the Lizardmen. It's a great DLC pack. It adds a lot for both of these races, in particular for the Beastmen. The unit types that this adds. Like, you get access to every other unit that you got in Call of the Beastmen, and you get access to more units. You can't confederate the other lords unless you own Call of the Beastmen. That's really the only reason to get Call of the Beastmen if you're playing Tarax. But, like, outside of that, like, it is a great experience. Like, similarly to my experience with the Wood Elves, because my experience as a content creator, I only started focusing on Total War in the last year. I had covered Total War before, but not full time. So I never bought Call of the Beastmen, because they were trash, for obvious reasons. When this DLC came out, I bought it, and I never really had a reason to borrow Call of the Beastmen until I focused full time on content creation for Warhammer 3. So if you're looking to play the Beastmen, this is the DLC for it. If you're looking to play the Lizardmen, this is the DLC for it. Then we get Ogre Kingdoms, another F-tier DLC. It's probably better than the Curse of the Vampire Coast, though really these two DLCs are trash. Race Pack is horrible. The Ogres are a horrible race. At least they have an army. That's something the Vampire Coast can't really claim. But the problem is the Ogre economy is pathetic. Their campaign mechanics don't work well. The camp issues are a problem. And honestly, just the idea of the camps themselves and reliant on them is quite a problem, to the degree that even with mods they improve them and can make the Ogres far more powerful and better on the campaign map, there's still issues. Like, there's mods that do fix the Ogres in a lot of ways, but there's still issues that you will have with the limitations of camps. And in particular, how slow the pacing is for an Ogre campaign. Warhammer 3 is about early game aggression, building up things as quickly as possible. That's something the Ogres can't really do very effectively. They don't have the economy. A lot of their heroes and units are locked behind the camp, so it ends up being a pretty terrible experience to play their campaign. Then we have the Champions of Chaos. Champions of Chaos as a DLC, like, I would rank it similarly to the Warriors of Chaos, though maybe slightly lower. No, it's on probably the same level. Like, Warriors of Chaos would be ranked higher. It has the better campaigns than the Champions of Chaos, but of course Be'lakor, who gives you access to a race for free, certainly does nullify a lot of the advantages you do have there. Champions of Chaos do give you more units, hero types, the variants, all that. There's some interesting things, of course, from this DLC, but like I'd say the Undivided Legendary Lords are far better to play overall than these ones. Except Valkia. Valkia is a pretty good campaign to play here, but Village, not a great situation. Village, not a great campaign. Festus is okay, but I wouldn't necessarily play a Festus campaign. Not because it doesn't work, but again, you have some limitations here that you just don't have with the Undivided Lords. I'd say the main value of this DLC is if you're playing Archaon or Be'lakor, you can then confederate the other lords. If you don't, you won't be able to, based on what I know. Then we have Forge of the Chaos Dwarves. Here's where I stand on Forge of the Chaos Dwarves. I think that I'm going to put it A tier and instead of S tier. My reasoning for doing so is, while I certainly think the Chaos Dwarves are one of the best races in the entire game, they're a lot of fun to play, they have a great roster, they're designed well for both campaign and battle, they're still too overpriced right now to put anything higher. When we get a 50% discount on Forge of the Chaos Dwarves, I would say absolutely grab it. With only a 20% for the most expensive DLC in the history of the game, not worth it. It can't be justified. Like, if you want to buy this DLC, understand that you're playing more than you had in the past. As a race pack, whatever way you want to count that. Great DLC, horrible business practices from Creative Assembly, and that's what I'm reflecting over here in this tier list. And then Shadows of Change. Here's my view on Shadows of Change. It's not quite as bad as Curse of the Vampire Coast, but still easily one of the worst DLCs, actually the worst DLC that Creative Assembly ever released beyond the Blood Pack. At least Curse of the Vampire Coast has the redeeming quality that when it came out, within the context of Warhammer 2's campaign style, it worked. It just hasn't been transferred very well into Warhammer 3. That's the problem. I mean, Ogres have always been terrible, to be clear on this. But Shadows of Change. While Jan Bo is a fun campaign, to be sure, and he can be interesting to play, beyond the price situation, the fact that this is genuinely the most expensive DLC for a Lord pack. Like, Forge of Chaos Dwarves is the most expensive race pack. Shadows of Change is the most expensive Lord pack. And it is ridiculous that we've gotten to this situation. It doesn't add enough. It doesn't fix Kislev. Yes, you get a powerful unit. It doesn't fix Kislev. It doesn't fix Tzeentch in any way. The Changeling campaign is pretty fucking awful and very boring. Oh, but I control the enemy on the campaign map. Doesn't matter. Like, it might be fun, I guess, for co-op games if you're playing the Changeling, though, honestly, if I was playing a co-op game, I would hard ban the Changeling, because the potential of getting screwed over by someone would be so high. Like, that would be my view. Like, no one gets to play the Changeling. But honestly, from the single-player perspective, the Changeling campaign is boring, grindy, and forgettable. You'll dominate the map, but you won't eliminate factions. You don't want to eliminate factions. And that's kind of the problem over there. Mother Stankia, not a great campaign. She's actually worse than Boris Ursus in terms of her strength ranking, just because Boris Ursus, while he doesn't have, like, the malediction ritual that can affect an entire race on the campaign map, Boris Ursus has a much more powerful economy, thanks to Dash. And also a much easier time in his campaign. Like, starting as a Kislev Legendary Lord away from Kislev and all the implications that come from that is not a great situation to deal with in your campaign. And while Jan Bo can, like, the only redeeming quality of this DLC in any way is Jan Bo, And if like I was talking about the quality, like that might merit putting it like on a D tier, but like there's no fucking way I'm putting Shadows of Change on anything other than F, because of the scummy business practices that Creative Assembly moved on to with this DLC. Let me tell you what I think they were trying to do with Shadows of Change. They were trying to nickel and dime people. They were trying to make a DLC on the cheap without the substantial changes that we need in certain races. They did not fix 2 of the really horrible races. They did not fix Siege. They did not fix Kairos in any way, shape, or form. Hell, even patch 4.1 doesn't fix Kairos in any singular way. His campaign is still awful. They did not really fix Kislev. Oh yeah, actually that can be good. Yeah, that's not the problem for Kislev in a campaign. While it adds power, it's not really the biggest problem. Their economy is. And while I appreciate the things they added to Cafe, it's not good enough to redeem the scummy business practices CA displayed over here with this particular DLC. If you buy this DLC, if you accept this DLC, then you're just setting up future failure. You're gonna accept that the $25 price point is the standard price for DLC packs going forward. That's my stance on it. Yes, I've played it. Obviously, I do this for a job. It's not worth it. Unless you really, really, really like Cafe and have a lot of money, it is not worth it at all. It's not worth it for Kislev. Even as a Kislev fan, like, when I started a Stankia's campaign and I saw what they had not done in Kislev's campaign, I was furious beyond measure. That was my perspective on that. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with me. Oof, I didn't put Prophet the Warlock as an S tier. Well, Claw's position in Skaven Blight is crap, and Tenuin is not worth it. That's my defense on that. I don't think it's going to be good enough.